I'm David Brancaccio. From APM, American Public Media.
Liberty Life, the pro-military paper and audio articles from Kings Bay to Camp Blanding. Serves Army, Navy, Air Force, Coast Guard, and Marines. Liberty Life is available wherever the military, veterans, and their families gather. Online at libertylifemedia.com.
North Florida TPO, proud sponsor of WJCT's First Coast Connect, bringing to the community innovation in transportation planning, commuter services, clean fuels, and intelligent transportation systems. More at northfloridatpo.com.
Baptist Health is a proud supporter of First Coast Connect. Baptist Health, committed to building a healthier community for all of us. More info at 202-4YOU or baptistjacks.com.
This is WJCT News 89.9 Jacksonville. Up next, national and local news from NPR and the WJCT News team.
Good morning, I'm Ann Schindler, and on today's First Coast Connect, we're talking the week's biggest headlines with our panel of journalists. And the biggest headline, of course, is Hurricane Milton. Now that we know the damage done, what is Florida learning about the realities of resilience? Will back-to-back storms shift residents from wanting to return to wanting to retreat? What does science say about the role of climate change in these recent storms? And how is recovery impacted by storm misinformation? We're talking about all of that, plus an update on a sewage main break on Anastasia Island with our panel of journalists. Later, Jacksonville Today arts and culture editor Matt Shaw interviews NPR music critic Ann Powers about her new book, How Women Made Music. Join the conversation. Send your questions or comments to First Coast Connect at WJCT.org. Tag us on social or call us at 904-549-2937. It's all ahead this hour after the day's news.
Live from NPR News in Washington, I'm Kristen Wright. Former President Donald Trump will be in Colorado today. He's holding a campaign event near Aurora, where police and the city's mayor have said reports of Venezuelan gang activity in the Denver suburb are being exaggerated by Trump and others. Bente Birkeland with Colorado Public Radio reports.
Trump is speaking at a resort on the outskirts of the city of Aurora. Some have falsely claimed the city has been taken over by gangs, and Trump's campaign has called it a war zone. At a rally in New York, Trump first said he would visit Aurora and Springfield, Ohio.
You may never see me again, but that's okay. Gotta do what I gotta do.
Local officials, including the mayor, a Republican, say Aurora is safe, and Trump is conflating isolated incidents of gang activity. For local Trump supporters, this could be their only chance to see him in Colorado ahead of Election Day. For NPR News, I'm Bente Birkeland.
Former President Barack Obama campaigned for Vice President Harris in Pittsburgh last night. As NPR's Tamara Keith reports, he delivered a pointed message to black men.
At a campaign office in Pittsburgh, Obama said he's been hearing there isn't as much enthusiasm among black voters for Harris's run as there was for his. In particular, he said, among black men. Polls indicate former President Donald Trump may be making some inroads with black male voters, and others may not vote. Obama said men are coming up with all kinds of excuses, but he thinks
you just aren't feeling the idea of having a woman as president. And you're coming up with other alternatives and other reasons for that.
His message? Get over it. And Obama encouraged the volunteers in the room to talk to the people on the sidelines. Tamara Keith, NPR News.
The extent of the damage and disruption from Hurricane Milton in Florida is severe. Repairs to homes and businesses will take a long time, and many critical systems are offline still and failing. Close to 2.5 million people have no power in Florida. Energy Secretary Jennifer Granholm explains fuel is also short in some places.
Part of it is that as people are returning back to their homes, etc., they may be returning back to places where the stations are also without power, right? So in the next couple of days, this will smooth out, but these are spot outages because of the power shut off. And then before the hurricane, there was a lot of topping off and filling of gas tanks so that those stations weren't used to having that much, that many customers, that much need for gas.
Granholm speaking to CNN. She says utility workers from most states in Canada are in Florida helping. This is NPR News from Washington.
And the time is now 4 minutes after 9 o'clock. This is WJCT News 89.9 in Jacksonville. I'm Michelle Coram. A police-involved shooting killed a man last night in Jacksonville. According to the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office, police were surveilling, quote, some known gang members engaging in drug-related activities on Justina Road near the Jacksonville University campus. They say the shooting happened after officers approached and a 30-year-old man drew a gun toward them while attempting to flee. The local prosecutor's office is investigating. JSO says this was the 5th officer-involved shooting of the year. The nonprofit blood bank One Blood is asking Floridians not affected by Hurricane Milton to donate blood in the coming days. Amy Sanchez tells us more.
One Blood sent extra blood to more than 300 hospitals ahead of Hurricane Milton's landfall in southwest Florida. However, the blood bank says it will need to catch up now after many donation centers are closed for a few days due to the storm. Every blood type is needed, but especially O positive, O negative, and platelets. To donate, look for a One Blood Big Red bus or go to oneblood.org to find out which centers are open. I'm Amy Sanchez in Miami.
And Life South Community Blood Centers are also calling for donors in the wake of the storm. Temperature is in the 60s right now around Jacksonville. The afternoon should be mostly sunny and breezy from the northeast, mid-70s today.
For NPR comes from NPR stations. Other contributors include the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, supporting books, radio, podcasts, film, television, theater, and more to bridge science and the humanities. And the listeners who support this NPR station.
Support for First Coast Connect is provided in part by Baptist Health and North Florida TPO.
Opinions expressed on the First Coast Connect Week in Review are those of our panelists and do not reflect the views of WJCT News 89.9.
Good morning. I'm Ann Schindler, and it's Friday, which means it's time for our First Coast Week in Review. It's been a busy week, but one in our area really dominated the headlines, Milton. Today, we're exploring some of the biggest related headlines. What does this season of storms teach us about the meaning of resilience? At what point might a weather-beaten population choose to retreat over rebuilding? And what do we know about the role of climate change in recent storms? We talk about that, and we get an update on a massive sewage main break on Anastasia Island. We want to hear from you. If you were impacted by the storm or have thoughts about Florida's changing climate, you can email comments or questions to WJCT, First Coast Connect at WJCT.org. You can also call us at 904-549-2937. I am gratified to be joined this morning by 4 terrific local journalists. Sylvia Perry, editor of the Jacksonville Free Press. Good morning.
Good morning.
Dan Scanlon, reporter for WJCT News.
And good morning.
Good morning, Dan. Claire Goforth, attorney and investigative reporter at the Daily Dot.
Good morning.
Hey, Claire. And David Bauerlein, Metro reporter at the Florida Times-Union. Hey, David.
Good morning, Ann.
Good morning. So, David, one of the most iconic images of this storm was Tropicana Field, at the home of the Tampa Bay Rays, MLB Stadium, supposed to be a refuge for first responders and cleanup crews. And while it didn't withstand much, did it?
Right. They had the 360-degree drones showing where it just shredded the roof. All of it had collapsed onto the field. I think anybody who's ever been in a professional sports stadium, you kind of assume that they're built to withstand that kind of stuff. But this was a very powerful storm. And I think that was going to be a place where safety workers were going to go, responders were going to go. And I think they decided not to end up putting them there. But had they been there, you would have had these debris falling on people who were sent there to help to clean up after the storm. It just shows the power of the storm and that we can't really assume that any structures are fail-safe when these storms come in with those incredibly gusting winds.
Yeah, and fortunately, Claire, they did move these, the staging area prior to the storm, but it's not an easy move within hours of a major hurricane. it came ashore as a Category 3. We know that this roof was supposed to withstand winds up to 115 miles an hour, but this made landfall at 120. So it obviously not enough to withstand that, and really it was far less of a storm than it had been at one point out in the Gulf.
Yeah, and that's an important lesson to take from all of this is that while the models are much more accurate than they were in years past, it's not 100%. These storms shift. As they make landfall. We've seen it many times here in Jacksonville when a storm has come, and you have to plan for the worst case scenario because the last thing that you want to do is be caught when it's no more evacuating. And I mean, it's very good that they were able to predict that it was not going to withstand those winds and move the first responders back because I think that would have been a catastrophic loss of life. But just every time that you hear a storm is coming and they're giving you the worst case scenario, you have to consider that is what's going to happen.
Yeah. Sylvia, this storm at one point had wind speeds approaching 180 miles an hour, which is almost just kind of beyond imagining. Homes in Florida are basically required to be built to withstand 175 miles an hour, but that's new homes. That's not all homes. Certainly there's a lot of homes that, likely predate that. It is instructive, I guess, to see that while this storm was less than it was predicted to be, it really could have been much worse. I think that, the amount of damage done, obviously a lot less than it could have been here and there.
Yes, absolutely. I definitely think we in Jacksonville we literally have been spoiled. It's been, I think, nearly 60 years since a Category 5 has hit Jacksonville. And when you think about the homes that are built today.
Are you talking about Dora?
Yes.
I think that was a
Hurricane Dora.
1, wasn't it?
60?
I think that's
But it was
right.
a direct hit.
It was a direct hit, though. Yeah.
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 It was a direct hit.
And a serious
So-
serious storm. Yeah.
Very much so. But the homes that are built today are, yes, required to have certain code. And the ones back in the day were a lot more, mortar and built to last. But that in between time when we had a great development and influx of homes, well, you have homes that are just put up, and they blow away really fast. So fortunately, we have not had that experience, and Jacksonville has been lucky.
Yeah, we have been very lucky. And Dan, you remember well, the disaster in Homestead that Andrew was and how that forced a big change in codes, in building codes in Florida. But it's interesting, there's this place called Babcock Ranch in kind of the southwest of Florida. It's designed as the first hurricane-proof community. And it did well, I guess, during Hurricane Ian. It withstood major winds, but even that is designed for a wind speed less than what this storm was at one point when it was close to 180 miles per hour.
I visited Homestead 1 year after Andrew, and I can never forget seeing almost every roof still covered in a blue tarp, and the fact that the tree line suddenly stopped at a certain point as if a huge steamroller had come through. And then Helene and the impact on Cedar Key, looking at the video as roofs were peeling off and entire buildings were floating across a main street where I'd gotten some clam chowder a few years ago. That's the damage that occurred then. And then to watch that covered stadium peeling off like tissue paper, and the governor scared stiff that we were going to have 170-mile-an-hour winds, Cat 5, coming right down Tampa Bay's throat after Helene had gotten 7-10 feet of water. It was a blessing that it dropped to a Cat 3 and then shifted a bit south, and Milton wobbled a lot. Thank goodness for that. But the damage that occurred even as far in our direction as Palatka and St. Johns County, that storm still packed a wallop.
I mean, I guess the question is, David, what is resilience in this age? Asheville during Helene had actually built a backup water system so that if the primary system failed, they'd have this secondary system to get water to residents. They both failed. This was a system designed with challenges like, a changing climate in mind, and still not up to the task.
Yeah, part of resilience is just making the building stronger. I know when we moved to Jacksonville in the late 1990s and got a new house, and I went up to the attic, and they had put in so many nails in that roof. It was almost like an Indian nail bed in reverse. It was just, they really tightened the standards, made a lot of improvements. Even when you look at some of these disaster scenes where you see where there's hurricanes have wiped out a lot of the town, and you see, the newer buildings are still standing, the older buildings are gone. That does make a difference. On the other hand, there's 23 million people in Florida. The population continues to grow. So I can think resiliency partly would be, what are your building standards going to be? It could partly be, what are your improvements going to be in terms of emergency response? How do you get the lights back on faster? The last part of resiliency would be, you just say there's no build zones. There's no appetite for that in Florida. Nobody's saying this is an area that needs to be off limits to new development. So you have these cases where, like in Miami, you look at some of those places in Biscayne Bay where you have a little island out there in the bay, and it's just packed. There's like towers in
Fisher
it.
Island, yes,
Yeah,
where the
and
millionaires live.
And you go, surely that's a recipe for disaster if you ever have a storm come that way. But everybody wants to live close as possible to the water, and nobody's saying, no, you can't.
Yeah.
I will say that in Northeast Florida, it's mainly because people in the beaches don't want big towers lining the beach like they have in Daytona, and they put limits on construction heights. It really has kept, to some extent, Northeast Florida from being as overwhelmed by coastal development as some other parts of the state have been.
Interesting point. That's true. And up in parts of Nassau and also in St. Johns County. So, yeah. If you're just joining us, we're talking about the week's big headline, Milton. If you experienced damage or if you know somebody who did, give us a call at 904-549-2937 or email firstcoastconnect@wjct.org. We have a call from Stanley. Good morning on the north side. Good morning, Stanley.
Good morning, Ann and everybody. My concern is we talking about everything else, but what about Washington Heights for all these years? And I'm a native of Jacksonville. Y'all have not addressed that issue yet over in Washington Heights, and I'm over in that area sometime. And I'm appalled by the fact that you had all these different mayors for 52 years, 54 years, and nothing have changed over there in Washington Heights. It continued to flood, whether it's a small hurricane or a large hurricane, it flood out. But every time you want to talk about the conversation, it's about San Marco. What's wrong? Is this racism or just ignorance?
Stanley, thanks for your comments. Have you thoughts on that? I mean, obviously, we do hear a lot about San Marco, Sylvia, and periodically about Ken Knight Drive, off Moncrief. But Washington Heights in particular is an area that, gets less attention. You certainly hear the name a lot less.
Yes, you definitely do. I do not think it's a case of racism. It's another case of a neighborhood that is prone to flooding in the city. I recall during the emergency response by the mayor, they had shuttles going to each of these neighborhoods, providing transportation to shelters. So to say that it was forgotten, I don't think it is definitely a case. But I would suggest contacting your council person and making more pleas to do better drainage. I myself, I live on the north side as well in a flood-prone community, and on a rainy day, my house will get water. So I can definitely empathize, and it has nothing to do with the income bracket.
I went to Ken Knight Drive on Tuesday, and police were handing out flyers telling the residents that there would be a bus service to the Legend Center, and people were getting ready to move out, and it did flood, and as it always floods.
Yeah. If you have to file a damage claim, we got some good advice yesterday from insurance agent Matthew Carlucci Jr. We spoke to him about, what folks should be thinking about in the immediate aftermath of a storm. Let's take a listen.
You can go ahead and start making repairs. You can call repairmen, roofers, whatever you need to do. Just do a good job taking photos, videos, and keeping receipts, because at the end of the day, those photos, receipts, and videos need to tell the story of what you did right after, you filed the claim. And that makes the adjuster's job a lot easier. And when you make the adjuster's job easier, they write checks.
Yeah. So he's saying there, you don't have to wait, necessarily. You can move ahead, especially if you've got some critical repairs that need to be done. Claire, the question of, how much residents can take, I think is probably more pertinent on the West Coast right now than here, given the spate of storms and 2 in 2 weeks. What are people saying and thinking about retreat?
Well, some people are over it. They're ready to go. But mostly, no. People are still coming to Florida. What were the fastest growing state in 2022 and tied for the fastest growing state in 2023. Every year we get more people. People want to move here. And while there may be some residents who are tired of the storms and they're tired of the heat and the humidity. The climate here is challenging for anyone. You know, there are more people who want to move to Florida for many reasons. Um, so the state's going to keep growing. And I mean, to what we've previously been talking about development, there really isn't a lot of appetite in this state or in this city to make these, you cannot build here zones. And it is wildly unpopular when a storm comes through and destroys homes to say, no, you cannot rebuild there. I mean, it's politically untenable. So we're going to keep having these issues.
I mean, it literally is what every official says, Dan, in the wake of these is we will rebuild. There's never this maybe we'll rebuild, maybe it's time to pull back from these particularly vulnerable areas.
And yet the prudent thing to do is to remove that layer of buildings along the waterfront, to rebuild with reefs, with rocks, with marshland, to absorb the flow so that the folks who live across the street from the waterfront, who will now have the waterfront property, will have a nice vista and also are more flood-proof. But you're right, that's not happening because no government is offering money to buy that property up, at least not a lot of it.
Yeah, it's not just the climate, though, Sylvia. It's the insurance rates, right?
Oh my gosh. Now you're hitting it. When you think about Florida being a haven for not only retirees and a tax shelter and the good weather, when you look at the insurance rate and the fact that homeowners insurance has practically tripled within the past few years, not to mention at hurricane time, there's a hurricane deductible. So the deductible of $1,500 is gone. And unless your house sustains damage of 20, 25, 30,000, depending on the value of your home, the deductible doesn't even help you. So you're on your own for a lot of that responsibility. So insurance rates, it should be a deterrent when people consider moving to Florida. You may not have to pay a personal income tax, but you will pay another way.
Yeah. But I mean, moving to where, David, is the question. I remember a calculus a few years ago where Asheville was considered sort of the climate safe realm, one of several places in the country that didn't have to worry about extreme heat and didn't have to worry about hurricanes. And obviously that myth has been dispelled.
Yeah, I've heard the term halfbacks. It's people who come from the Northeast, move to Florida, like people are moving today, and then they get tired of hurricanes. They get tired of living on a coastal plain, but they don't want to move back to the cold, so they move halfway back. They're halfbacks, so they end up in Western North Carolina, and there's up in the mountains. And okay, well, that's not really a place where you're sheltered either from these effects of these horrific storms. And this flood damage was in some ways. As much as we've seen images out of what's happened in Florida, I think to me the overwhelming image of this storm season is what we saw in Western North Carolina with those torrents of water just sweeping away towns. I will circle back on just one thing, if I could, real quickly, on the issue of purchasing homes and creating those barriers. There has been attempts for years to do that in the Ken Knight Drive neighborhood. They've had state grants. They've tried to do it. But you can't condemn property. You can't force people to sell. You may have out of town people who own the homes. They drive a hard bargain. So you have this case where it's very difficult once development is in an area to go back and sort of quote correct that. We've seen that in some other neighborhoods here in Jacksonville where it's just really slow going to purchase homes, create that sort of natural buffer again. And that's a real lesson in how these things work. Resiliency means probably saying no in the first place. Very difficult politically to do that.
Wow, that's a really good point. We've got a call from Don on the south side. Good morning, Don. Go ahead.
Good morning. I moved in 68 or 69 to Florida from San Francisco, where right after the earthquake, I picked up a San Francisco contractor's license. And we learned to retrofit and build using all of the modern techniques to try to prevent and mitigate these problems. When I got to Jacksonville, I worked for a couple of outfits where I was a supervisor, and the inspections were so lax, so terrible, and my feeling about the building practices down here was terrible. They've gotten better, but I'm retired now, and I still have a thing about these inspections by people who are usually brothers-in-law or something that get into the building inspection game, and they let crap get by. And I just like someone to speak about that. Thank you.
Well, it's not just where we build, it's how we build. Clear lot development, draining wetlands, and putting a few retention ponds in. The ecosystem here is naturally designed to absorb floodwaters and rain. We're a tropical peninsula. But when you reverse that with the type of development that we do, because it's more cost effective, drive around town and you'll see it everywhere, it makes it harder for a community to weather these storms.
We have a call from Linda in Mandarin. Good morning, Linda. Go ahead.
Good morning. I was thinking with what's happening all over the U.S., we need to kind of rethink insurance, which was supposed to flatten out the risk and spread it around, but there's different risks. I have a flood policy. I'm not in the flood zone, but that gives extra money into the FEMA pot. FEMA just got $20 billion, and they've already spent $9 billion of it with the storm. So, holding our legislators accountable. If you're going to live in a state like Florida, all of the Florida Republican legislators voted against FEMA funding. And we need a national insurance for the fires in California, because nobody wants to ride out there. For hurricanes, pretty soon we're going to be uninsurable for hurricanes when you get 3 or 4 hurricanes in a year. Even though everybody's coming to Florida, yeah. Welcome to Florida, people.
Thanks, Linda. It's a good point. Sylvia.
One thing that we need to consider is that how much politics has evaded the way we structure our government, and even those that can help. I was listening this morning where it was sharing that FEMA has run out of half of its money for next year's fiscal cycle, and yet the request or possible request to get more money has been delayed until after the election. So it makes you wonder, what is the priority of our legislators in this matter?
Yeah, it's extraordinary to think about, Dan. They were budgeted for $20 billion. Their current balance, as Linda pointed out, is just $11 billion. It's only been a few weeks since the fiscal year began. I mean, that is an astonishing clip to be moving through that kind of money.
And let's see how quick the rest goes when we get through the Milton claims, which will be millions and millions in the first month guaranteed. And that doesn't even include what you're going to find later as the stuff, as your home is wet, as your home is deteriorating. And look at up all the stuff that was done up in North Carolina. A lot sucked out. You talk about resiliency. I heard on NPR yesterday, it's going to take so long to get water and sewer returned to the schools that some schools are actually planning to dig their own wells to get water, because that's resiliency. You'll always be able to sink a well and get drinking water and maintenance water.
And so, not in Arizona, but yeah, in some places.
Right.
We got a call from Eric on the south side. Good morning, Eric. Go ahead.
Good morning. Good morning. Enjoy your show. I want to just recap quickly population growth in Florida. So I'm a native, 77 years old, native of Jacksonville. There were about 2 million people in Florida in 1950. Now we have 23 million, so it's gone up 10 times. A child born today is going to be my age in 2100. What are they going to see? 230 million? 10 times 23 million? And I had a good laugh this morning, Dan, talking about building berms. How high you want to make the berm, Dan? It sounds like King Canute in Denmark putting his chair out on the beach and forbidding the tide to rise. So this is all going to change, and I've been predicting this for decades. Nobody's listening. We're going to have a Cat 3, 4, 5 come up the middle of the state. We all remember Floyd all backed up on I-10. Well, same thing happened down in South Florida. Go look at Google Earth and look at Siesta Key. Tens and tens of thousands of homes are underwater. This is not sustainable. So you folks might make it to 2050, 2060. So good luck, and Florida is going to have to depopulate. This cannot continue. And I can remember flooding in San Marcos 65 years ago. Our former mayor, Curry, said, everything's under control under Matthew. And the other caller talking about, it's just talk. It's just pablum. It just goes on and on and on. And they're building high-rises up and down San Marco Boulevard. What's that all about? It's all about the money and the developers. They control things. I appreciate your show. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. We appreciate your call. To his point, the changing climate is having, a real serious impact. We look at Milton and this new idea of rapid intensification of storms. So this typically is defined as a storm that increases by 35 miles per hour in a 24-hour period. Milton doubled that. Milton went from a Cat 1 at midnight to a Cat 5 at noon. So it increased by 106 miles per hour in a 12-hour period. It's really astonishing to think, but that is a reality, David, that is going to fundamentally impact the lives of everyday Floridians for centuries to come.
Right. There's a lot of controversy, and I think we'll probably talk some about that, about, climate change, man-made impact on it. I'm not a scientist, so I'll preface by saying that, but the basic science, as I understand it, is hurricanes are fueled by warm water. And if you have global warming, climate change, and the water is warmer, that's going to be a recipe for hurricanes to be stronger. It's not going to create a hurricane where none previously existed. It is going to result in more intense storms and storms that accelerate into categories faster, like we saw with that. It was incredible. Like that morning, every hour it was like, it's 3, now it's 4, now it's 5. Then it went down to 3, then it went up to 5. It was back at 3 when it hit. But, that is the reality of what it means to have warmer waters out there, and we're seeing it.
We've got a call from Conrad in Arlington. Good morning, Conrad. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to compliment y'all on keeping your word and keeping us abreast all night. After Matthew and Irma, they handled it differently. After Matthew, they switched over to 60, as I remember, the AM station, which was okay. At least it gave us some kind of coverage all night. After Irma, Melissa had told us that they would be there all night carrying on, and at 10 o'clock, the 89.9 went completely dead after a warning that the sheriff had declared a curfew, which we found out later never happened, and they switched to a station in Orlando. And the best part was, at 10 o'clock, what we got was a guy in Orlando answering a call from Jacksonville, and the guy says, "Jacksonville, where's that at?"
Oh my!
So this time y'all were there, or you at least had good direct coverage, and I just wanted to compliment you on it.
Well, thanks, Conrad. We appreciate it. We're doing our best. We definitely had our news staff working around the clock here at the station and spending the night.
And the Gulf of Mexico is warming up, and my favorite saying is, you boil the water long enough, you're going to get soup. Well, the soup basin, the soup pot, is the Gulf of Mexico, and we've had rapid heating there. So we're going to see probably, I'm predicting one more is going to form before we get to November.
Well, so that's, related to our next topic, because there was initially a lot of conversation like there's another storm brewing. That has been basically debunked by, meteorologists around here. I mean, there could something forming, but nothing in the immediate forecast. We spoke this week to the former chief of staff of FEMA, Jason McNamara, and we talked to him a little bit specifically about the challenges of misinformation. Let's hear a little bit about what he had to say.
It has become the new normal. There isn't really a disaster season anymore. You used to be able to know when the floods were going to come and when hurricane season was going to happen. But really at any time during the year, you could have a major or close to catastrophic or potentially even a catastrophic disaster. So the short answer to your question is they all understand there that they could be called on at any time, but they certainly are, they certainly, from a resource perspective, they certainly are stretched and they try to leverage what they have.
I apologize. He was talking there about FEMA resources. We did talk to him about misinformation, though. And, part of the problem there, Claire, is we're seeing it not just from, individual actors, but in some cases from officials who are, talking about how FEMA is responding or perhaps not responding in ways that local officials have debunked, but those rumors persist.
Well, I mean, former President Donald Trump is an excellent example. He lied and said that the maximum people were getting from FEMA is $750. And in reality, that is money that you get immediately so that you can escape a storm or deal with some short-term costs, and you can file for additional funding. And disclosure, my mother retired from FEMA about a year ago. I can tell you from personal experience that FEMA is underfunded. Their staff is stretched to the absolute max. I mean, when these storms happen, as they are increasingly happening, it was never, I mean, it was just very common for my mother to be and her colleagues to be working 12 hours a day, 7 days a week. That's not tenable. That is very difficult for the staff. I mean, they do their very best, but we're going to keep seeing these disasters, and we have to think of the priority of funding such things. And our politicians also need to be responsible for telling lies, and people who spread those lies should. You're hurting people. That's
You
just
help
the fact of the matter. You're hurting people.
Circling back to Conrad's call, misinformation, it causes mayhem. It spreads like wildfire. And unfortunately, we live in an age where most of the people get their news from the internet and different platforms rather than a trusted news source. I started receiving TikToks XYZ of the hurricane hitting Venice. You saw them pictures of a flooded Disney World, and that causes sheer mayhem. And streets are flooded XYZ. Instead of people sheltering, as they say, in place or sheltering in a safe place, everyone is running amok. And it doesn't help when your officials are not held accountable and just saying stuff for clout, as we like to say, instead of trying to be an accountable official.
I'm curious, David. I mean, I have found as a reporter, even it is getting more difficult to find information, whether it's through other news sources, because everything is sort of split into so many platforms. And so you can go to, for instance, the St. Johns County Sheriff's site and you can find some information there. But there are also a lot of, proprietary Facebook pages that they're not necessarily putting out all of the information. And in fact, some cases they might want to diminish some information because it might not be favorable. But it is really hard to find, that granular level understanding what's happening in different places because news outlets are stretched so thin.
Right, without a doubt. There's fewer staffing, fewer reporters actually out there on the ground, fewer reporters to pick up the phone and call people. I think that's a definite trend in terms of local news gathering, and it does make it more difficult to fully cover these storms and really dig down, as you would say, and beyond just the surface for what we're getting from some of the agencies. And then the social media part of it is the crazy part because people do get news, quote news from those sources as well. And then on top of that, you have public officials. Claire brought up the part about saying, well, it's just $750. Well, that has real harm because then people don't apply for more because they think, oh, I've got all I'm going to get. Or you had this case of the Congresswoman Green saying that there was geoengineering or something like that to cause storms to get worse. The federal government was actually making storms more dangerous. I mean, and then that's a public official. That's on social media. And so that gets sort of echoed. And so it's difficult on the one hand to actually be that trusted news source so that people are going to go to you, and also to be able to have access to all that information so that you can really provide full information to people.
And a prime example happened this week. There was an accident on the Main Street Bridge, and suddenly the day before the hurricane hit, and people were going, evacuate downtown. The bridges are starting to shut down. It was an accident. Earlier, DOT had locked the bridge lift per Coast Guard rules. That probably freaked some people out to see that bridge closed briefly for that, and that's incorrect. That was a safety measure, and then a crash. Nothing to do with bridges being shut down. No bridges shut down here in Duval County because of wind.
Yeah, and it continues, as you say, Claire. I mean, it is a challenge to find that information, to verify that information. All the more reason that people really do their fact checking.
Yes, and there are so many bad actors out there. As someone who reports on misinformation and conspiracy theories very regularly for the Daily Dot, it's incredible. I mean, Marjorie Taylor Greene is just one example of so many others. And, some of these people have enormous platforms where they'll have a million or more followers actually believing what they say. And, then you have the Florida Times-Union, who does an excellent job with the resources that they have. But in the time that I've lived here, I feel like the staff has shrunk like tenfold or something like that. David, would you say? With those like fewer reporters, there's just not. Well, we can never keep up with it. We can never keep up with it. And then every Joe Schmo with a camera who likes to hear themselves talk on the internet considers themselves a journalist when they actually really do not. They're not held accountable, and they really don't take it seriously.
I think I was going to say, I think the city of Jacksonville has done a really good job over the years, including this hurricane season, with regular briefings are televised. People are getting that information. There's a lot of detailed information that comes out of that. To some extent, I would say that the information apparatus, it's usually at the state level. There's a lot of details you can get on power outages, all that stuff. Dashboards, those have improved over time. I think the question would be, if you want to go a little bit further, how easy or difficult is it to do that?
David Bauerlein, Sylvia Perry, Claire Goforth, and Dan Scanlon, thank you all so much for being here today.
Thank you.
Global warming is real.
Right. Up next, Jacksonville Today music editor Matt Shaw talks to music writers Ann Powers and Allison Fenterstein.
Allison Fensterstock and Ann Powers, thanks so much for speaking with me. I'm excited to talk to you about this book. It looks like a massive and important undertaking.
Well, thank you. Yeah, it's great to be here.
Yeah, thanks so much for having us.
So the book is How Women Made Music, and it's drawn in large part from the series Turning the Tables, as well as the NPR archives. You've both contributed to the Turning the Tables series, and it's grown to be kind of this multimedia environment with podcasts and live performances and video. Can you talk about the framing of the series Turning the Tables, the rewind, remix, and represent, that's kind of the subtitle, and the impetus behind starting that series?
Yeah, well, quite a long time ago now, Allison and I were with our friend Jill Sternheimer in New Orleans at a show. It was this amazing guitarist named Barbara Lynn, and she's great. She was a pioneer, I don't know, Allison, how old is she now? In her 80s or something like that, on all these lists. So we thought, okay, how can we fight back against this obvious sort of marginalization of women? And the solution we came up with initially was, what if we told the history of popular music only through the voices and stories of women? So first thing we did was make a list of the 150 greatest albums by women. And then from then on, it just grew and changed. And we did series on different points in history. And finally, we came to a point where we felt we should compile all this into a book. And we also got the idea to expand it by including interviews with artists or excerpts from interviews with artists from throughout NPR's history. And now we have this fabulous compendium.
No regrets, Coyote. We just come from such different sets of circumstance. I'm up all night in the studio.
In the series, the essays that have been contributed are mostly by women journalists and women writers who maybe even aren't music journalists. Donnie Walton, the author, has done one, and it's really an all-star cast when you look at the website. Can you talk about some of the writers that you chose to include in the book? I was excited to see personally, and I think I learned this through social media, but Elizabeth Nelson, whose writing I adore.
Yeah, we love Elizabeth.
Yeah, she's so good. And then the jazz radio podcaster, tastemaker, Kiana Faircloth. Some really fantastic writers. Can you talk about the collection of voices that you curated for the series and then included in the book, and maybe what you hope readers will infer about maybe the state of music writing?
Oh, that's an that wound up in an interesting place.
We love these questions.
Yeah. But yeah, I mean, the initial, the collection that started the whole thing, the list of 150 greatest albums by women in music, were the people who contributed were a lot of people that were working in music journalism and also NPR hosts that weren't necessarily covering music, but were very excited to jump in. And then as the series went on, we were able to invite people unfortunately, Donnie Walton's essay is not in the book, but we got some fiction writers and some other writers that just had really very interesting personal essay perspectives and memoiristic reads on the music that they were listening to. And then we found for the book, Elizabeth Nelson, we got her specifically for the book, which I had made friends with her on Twitter. And I'm just obsessed with her incredibly concise and efficient descriptions of albums. I think she's an amazing writer, and I'm so glad to have her in here. And we also have some scholars like Melissa Weber, who's the curator at the Hogan Jazz Archive at Tulane University, where in New Orleans, where I live. I knew she was a big Parliament Funkadelic head. She was obsessed, especially with the Brides of Funkenstein and the other women that were part of the whole collective. So we let her loose, to write an essay defending them. So, and we also have musicians like Kaya Cater, who wrote a great piece on Rhiannon Giddens and her influence on her as a musician and as just a thinker and someone who was conscious of the history of the music she was playing. So we have perspectives from kind of all across the board.
One of the beautiful things about music writing right now, even as you well know, I'm sure, Matt, the media seems to be shrinking, right?
Right.
The outlets seem to be falling one by one, and we can kind of get in a dark place if we think about that. But music writing has actually grown in these incredible ways over the past few decades. As Allison mentioned, scholarship, writing within academia about music is just totally blossomed, and so many women, especially women of color, are doing great work in that field of music scholarship, and we have many of them in this volume, from Farah Jasmine Griffin to Karen Tongson to Maureen Mann to I don't know, many. At the same time, when I started as a music journalist back in the prehistory, the age of the dinosaurs, I was often the only woman in the room. I was often the only woman, or one of two or three on a given masthead. And now so many of the top jobs belong to women, whether editorial jobs or columnists. And we're really happy to have many of those women in this book, and they've contributed to the series over the years. So did we help form that community? I like to think that we did, actually. I'll give ourselves a little credit for that. At the same time, it's just been a thrill to be part of this sea change.
Yeah. And I was going to ask about that specifically because you've both been in the music writing, music journalism game for some years now. I want to go back to maybe when you were starting out. You mentioned that, Anne, that maybe you were one of a few on the mastheads at the publications you were working for or contributing to at that point. And I know that at least into the 90s, there was even in radio, there was this sometimes unspoken, sometimes actually spoken rule about playing back-to-back female-led acts on the radio. And then music media, print media specifically, was much more robust than it is today. What was it like writing about music when you started? Were there parallel rules to the one I mentioned in radio in place?
I mean, I don't know about rules. I feel like I started a little bit later than Anne did. I worked at a daily newspaper in New Orleans and an alt weekly. So I covered a lot of local music, but also at a daily paper, you have to be a generalist. And I think I chose to cover women artists more often than not because I didn't think anyone else was going to do it, which may be an experience Anne had as well, which you sort of accidentally wind up putting yourself into that box because no one else is going to cover the women. So then you become the woman.
the woman. Yeah, that definitely happened to me. And I will say one thing about this book, How Women Made Music, that feels very full circle to me. Back in the mid 90s, my friend and colleague Evelyn McDonnell and I edited a book called Rock She Wrote, which was a collection of women writing about popular music. It was the first collection ever of all women writing across genres about popular music. And we had this amazing time doing that, really not only bringing the world around to these women writers, but in some ways introducing them to each other across generations. And I am very proud that we now have another book that celebrates the newest generation of music writers as well as some elders. I mean, the age range of writers in this book is quite great, from women in their 20s to women at least in their 60s, maybe even older. And so I just want people to know that women have been writing about music for as long or longer than men. I did some research once into the very early days of rock and roll. And what's interesting? The first writing about rock and roll was really by women because it was considered a youth phenomenon. It was
Congaree & Pen, dedicated to agriculture and culinary endeavors, offering field-to-fork dining and outdoor experiences on over 300 acres. Sip, dine, explore. Information at congareeandpen.com.
Wayne Hogan of the Terrell Hogan Personal Injury and Wrongful Death Law Firm. Serious injury cases are complex, and civil trial attorneys present the evidence juries need to see and hear. More at waynehogan.law.
On the next Florida Roundup, the rescue and recovery from Milton. The historically strong hurricane is the second major storm to hit Florida in as many weeks. More than 1 million people were under evacuation orders. Dangerous storm surge flooding homes and businesses, power outages, no internet. Did you evacuate? Maybe you opened your home to folks fleeing the storm's path. Email us radio@thefloridaroundup.org. I'm Tom Hudson. Then join us Friday noon until 1.
Millions adjust to life after Milton. The power goes off for large parts of Florida as the White House responds to lies about the rescue and recovery.
It's un-American. It's not who the hell we are. What are they talking about?
Also, federal prosecutors signaled their intent to break up Google, and states are given a deadline to make sure their pipes are lead-free. Much more next time on 1A's Friday News Roundup.
Today, starting at 10 on WJCT News 89.9.
Welcome back. The Civic Orchestra of Jacksonville kicks off its 9th season with Composers of Courage, featuring an all-female composer lineup. Joining me to discuss the performance, I'm joined by Jeffrey Odie, who plays the French horn with the Civic Orchestra. Good morning, Jeffrey.
Good morning.
And I'm also joined by Molly Sweet, who plays the clarinet and who's actually brought her clarinet to play for us today. Hi, Molly.
Hi, good morning.
So start off by telling me a little bit, Jeffrey, about the goal of the Civic Orchestra for people who aren't familiar with its mission and kind of who comprises the orchestra.
Sure. The orchestra is made up of all volunteer musicians. Some are students, some are retired professionals, and like myself, I'm a working adult, but I love music, so I love to play. The orchestra's performances are free, open to the public. They're considered family friendly, which means they're a little bit shorter than maybe some of the other orchestras. We try to stay within an hour time length, so you can bring your kids. They'll enjoy themselves, maybe not get a little too fidgety. And you know, I would say our big point is we try to make sure that the music is accessible and free and open to everyone in the city of Jacksonville.
And so, Molly, what was the idea behind devoting this entire segment on women composers in particular?
Well, I think that we have this unique opportunity to look back at some music that had really fallen into obscurity before. It's interesting, our first rehearsal, when our conductor, Dr. Richardson, got onto the podium, she usually every time asks how many of the musicians had played any of these pieces before. And this was the first time that nobody in the orchestra raised their hand for any of the pieces. So the opportunity to bring these back to life and bring them to the present is really exciting.
Wow. And so tell us about who these female composers are and roughly kind of what generation time frame they inhabit.
Well, we have four composers. Cecile Chaminade, she was from 1857 to 1944, French composer. Emily Mayer, German composer, 1812 to 1883. Florence Price, American composer, 1887 to 1953. And then Ethel Smith, 1858 to 1944, and she's an English composer.
And so these were new to you, Molly, as well as everybody else in the Civic Orchestra, which is fascinating. You have some segments that you're going to play for us on your clarinet here. Tell us what it is that you're going to play first and maybe a little bit about the composition.
Sure. Yeah. So I'm going to play a couple excerpts. Of course, this is just going to be my part. There's a lot more to it when the full orchestra is playing, but we can't fit them all in the studio today. But this is the Chaminade, and I'd say Chaminade is probably the most well-known out of our roster of female composers. But I'd never heard of this piece, and it's a four-movement piece called the Callerho. So I'll play a couple movements. I've got a part in the first movement, which is a prelude. It's got this beautiful stately melody and the clarinet and the horn, and then it kind of passes through the woodwind section. It's just really beautiful. So I'll go ahead and play that.
Terrific. Thank you.
Then moving on to the second movement, this in French translates to the scarf dance. So it's a interesting melody. It starts out kind of waltzy, but this segment of it changes character. So this is scarf dance. All right, there is this third movement, but the clarinet part, it doesn't really have too much in it, so I didn't have a good excerpt to pull out of that. And then finally, the fourth movement is the dance of the cymbals, and it's interesting. It's a very exciting part. The clarinet starts this melody that goes through the whole orchestra, and then in between, the crash cymbals are actually accenting the beats, so I think that's kind of the feature of this piece.
It's lovely.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for playing that. So that is the Callerhost Suite by Chaminade,
Mhm.
right? You are also going to be performing, you said Emily Mayer's Faust's Overture.
Overture.
I'm guessing that is a significantly different sound.
Yeah, I would say it's a kind of a much heavier sound, would you say?
Yeah, it's got a lot of drama to it.
Right. It's Faust, so yes, very dramatic.
So this is going to be performed Sunday, October 13th. It's at the St. John's Cathedral on Church Street, downtown Jacksonville from 4 to 5.
That's correct.
All right. Thank you so much for being here, Molly. Jeffrey, appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. That's our program. Thanks so much for listening. We encourage you to send your feedback and suggestions to First Coast Connect at wjct.org. And if you missed anything, you can catch our rebroadcast at 8 o'clock tonight, or you can find our entire program archive on your favorite podcast platform. I'm Ann Schindler. You've been listening to First Coast News on WJCT News 89.9.
Support for First Coast Connect is provided in part by Baptist Health and North Florida TPO.
Baptist Health is a proud supporter of First Coast Connect. Baptist Health, committed to building a healthier community for all of us. More info at 202-4YOU or baptistjacks.com.
North Florida TPO, proud sponsor of WJCT's First Coast Connect, bringing to the community innovation in transportation planning, commuter services, clean fuels, and intelligent transportation systems. More at northfloridatpo.com.
The National Ballet of Ukraine's premier U.S. tour features the nation's elite dancers, an immersive scenic 3D screen, and guests Ukrainian Shumka folk dancers. One night only, Monday, October 21st at the Moran Theater. Tickets at nationalukraineballet.com.